Yeah, I'll start by, again, thanking all of you for tuning in to this talk or presentation. And again, thanks to Rod for liaising with me for it. As he said, as he alluded to, I've been lucky enough to spend time at Sanga Lodge myself with himself and Tam. So it's a privilege to be able to share a little bit of where I call home with you all this evening. And so, yes, my talk is entitled The Other KNP, the Kafue National Park in Zambia, conservation in one of the world's largest national parks. And of course, it's by myself, Tyrone McKeith, and I'm the co-owner of a safari company, Jeffrey McKeith Safaris, as well as being the co-sort of founder of a non-profit conservation organization, Musekesi Conservation. So I'll give you, hopefully an insight into both of those and the park through this talk and this evening. So let's go to the next slide here. So I suppose the best place to start is with where the Kafue even is. So here's a map of Zambia. It's a funny old shape. Some of the better known areas, of course, in Zambia, you've got Livingstone down here by the Vic Falls, the Luangwa Valley, quite a well-known wildlife area in the east of the country over here. But this big old chunk of bush in the western part of Zambia, this is the Kafue. And so this is where we'll be focusing on this talk here. Lusaka, as you can see, not too far away from the Kafue. I appreciate that this slide's probably a little bit small for you all to see, but it's just to point out, this is a zoomed in version of the map I just showed you, of the shape of the Kafue, the green being the national park itself. So yeah, the Kafue, same size as the Kruger, the other KNP, but we get just 1% of the visitor numbers that the Kruger gets. So that's not many people. And many people that know the Kafue love it for that very fact, the isolation that you get in the park. The park's big. That's basically what I was getting at. 22,500 square kilometers. That's about the size of Belgium or Wales. They often like to put that in. And it's this big old chunk of green. But if we include the outside areas, the yellow buffer zones, 50,000 square kilometers of pristine bush. It's still intact, and so it's a vast and very valuable chunk of land here in South Central Africa. The next slide here is to remind me about the history of the Kafue. It's actually the oldest national park in Zambia, the first one proclaimed in the 50s. And it was created with great foresight. It is so large because the idea from the outset was not just to incorporate where the wildlife seemed to be along the course of the Kafue River, but to incorporate the greater watershed and water catchment areas of not just the Kafue River itself, but the major tributaries as well. So there was a lot of ecological thought going into the proclamation of this national park. And that's why, one of the major reasons why it's so big. This photo here is also an interesting one. It shows some of the history of the park. These two gentlemen in this old Land Rover, this is Norman Carr, and you may well have heard of Norman Carr, more from his Luangwa exploits, but a few people realize that in the 60s, he was actually the first warden of the Kafue National Park. And as a consequence, he spent many years here before moving on to the Luangwa. Where, of course, he's better known for being hailed as, I suppose, the pioneer of the walking safari here in Zambia. But yeah, here's a photo of Norman in the Kafue, no doubt fighting off a few Tetsis with Bill Steele. So let me come on to the next slide, an interesting one here. So you may well have heard of Norman Carr before, maybe from his books or his, there was a film out as well, Return to the Wild, about these two lion cubs that he raised, Little Boy and Big Boy. These lions were actually from the Kafue, from the Ngoma area, and they were handed to Norman at his time as the park warden. They were found in the nearby villages around Ngoma, abandoned. And so Norman raised these cubs, and then yeah, he spent their formative sort of years as this slide shows you, growing old. But here at the park gates of the headquarters in the southern part of the park, in Goma, what a time that must have been to come as a visitor to the Kafue and have this lion walk through the gate entrance. So Norman was reposted to the Luangwa, and he took these lions with him, and hence the name of the book and the film, Return to the Wild. I believe that they fathered cubs in the area that Norman moved to, and so it just sort of makes me wonder what happened to the genetics of the lion population now in the Luangwa. I wonder if there's a bit of Kafue genes. You know, our lions in the Kafue are known for being very dark maned lions. The Luangwa less so. So it just sort of spikes my interest in wondering what that did to the population in that area. So coming back to the present day, this last map here shows the area of operation of myself, of our safari operation. We've got 2 camps in the northern part of the Kafue. The top part of this map here shows the Kafue out in the west, and then we zoom in a little bit to the northwestern part of the Kafue itself. As you can see, just in the bottom, Musakesi is demarcated with a small paw print. That's our main camp, and that's situated on the eastern bank of the Kafue River. And the Kafue River itself flows in from the park in the northeast of the park, through to the central part of the park, and all the way down to the south. The Kafue River is one of the 2 major tributaries of the Zambezi. And in fact, the Kafue is the only truly Zambian river. And what I mean by that is that it begins and ends within Zambia and doesn't share any borders with any other countries. So, you know, that's not the case for the Zambezi and the Luangwa. And so it's a proudly Zambian river. The area, let me get my pointer, the area up here in the top northwestern sector of the Kafue, this is the Pasanga Plains region. And the Pasanga Plains is one of the better known areas of the Kafue National Park. As you can see, there's a little cluster of camps up here in the papyrus, towards the papyrus section. Our seasonal camp is on the southern part of the Pasanga Plains, a little ways away from these camps. So yeah, that's where we operate from our tourism perspective. So yeah. That just gives you a bit of a scale of the place. The Pasanga Plains themselves are 700 square kilometers in their own right. So yeah, just to get from Musakesi to Ntemwa itself, that's about a 70-kilometer trip, taking 3 or 4 hours on our road. So it's a vast, vast area. The next slide, though, it's a little video, and I do hope this works. It's a short clip of a typical scene in the central part of the Kafue. So this is not the Pasanga Plains. And I think people often think that the park starts and stops on the Pasanga Plains. But this is a typical Dambo Lagoon system in the central part of the park. What I mean by Dambo is a flay or a seasonally sort of inundated lagoon, typically oxbows. And as you can see, it's a stunning place. You could be forgiven for thinking that this is the Okavango, but no, this is the central part of the Kafue, and I hope that video did manage to play for you. But to see this Dambo here that we're looking at, this is literally taken a few days ago from the air, but the same Dambo, when it dries out, you wouldn't believe it's the same place. Let me just skip to the... And so, indeed, this is the very same Dambo, but in the early dry season. And this is actually the view from my home, our base camp at Musakesi Camp. And it overlooks this 6-kilometer long lagoon in the central part of the park. It's nicknamed the Eden Lagoon, and that wasn't some grandiose idea that we came up with. When Phil and I discovered this lagoon, we took a few of our staff members over to have a look, and the amount of wildlife that congregates in this 6-kilometer long stretch of bush, really, it needs to be seen to be believed, and those of you listening that have seen it will believe me. And my staff had never seen wildlife in that density in the park. And so they turned around, and I think it was Pride turned around and said to me, "This must be Eden." And so that stuck. It was a very sweet thing to hear. And so, yes, this is our main area of our camp at Musekesi here. And as you can see by this slide, you don't have to go very far for to see the inhabitants of the area. But it also goes to show with that video and the difference between the wet and the dry, how tough it is when people ask me what's our favorite time of year. You know, the dry season, of course, you may well have residents like this from your deck, but in this time of year, when it's wet and full of water, it really is absolutely phenomenal. The lilies, etc. It's so very different, very hard to compare. Next slide here. Yeah, this is a remarkable photo in its own right, and an amazing little story. Last season, we couldn't work out what was chewing on our shoes and our cushions and our blankets. I mean, there were a few clues, but we couldn't really believe. We were seeing cat prints on the bar tops, and you know, it was very strange. I thought somebody was winding me up, so I put a camera trap in the main area, and we found this young male leopard had become very relaxed, it seems, made himself at home, and we nicknamed him Trouble because he did, for the majority of last season, cause a little bit of trouble. You know, he was tearing through the cushions, and our guest book is made of leather, and he quite enjoyed to chew on the leather. But yeah, anyway, it's not very often you see a leopard on your couch, but and that just shows you how wild that Musekesi area is. So that's a funny one. But let me bring it back a little bit, maybe for you, give a bit of context to myself. How did a young lad from the UK end up in the Kafue National Park? And for me, it all started, as you can see, when I was young. An early life of travel with my father gave me the interest in wildlife that I have. It's as simple as that. And I was very lucky to travel, much of it in Africa. And it was ultimately this which inspired me to go and further my education. And it was the Kafue itself specifically, which was a place that my father was very fond of. And as a consequence, we spent a lot of time in the Kafue. Yeah, and this picture here specifically is a photo of myself and a man by the name of John Chibwantu. And John used to take me out on walks from a young age in the Lufupa area. Again, central Kafue, but on the western bank, almost opposite where I am now at Musekesi, believe it or not. So as the crow flies, not very far away. So these are obviously very fond memories for me, my childhood and spending time in the Kafue, and in retrospectively, obviously very formative experience as well. And I was very lucky to spend most of my school holidays here. As I say, it's what inspired me to further education, and I was very lucky to attend the Durrell Institute of Conservation and Ecology at the University of Kent, also known as DICE, where I studied wildlife conservation. It's actually at university where I met my colleague and friend, Phil Jeffrey, who's a Zambian, and whose father, Richard, was introduced earlier, and who was listening in as well. And it's with Phil, and let me point him out here. I've got the laser pen. Richard probably laugh at seeing a younger version of his son here, Phil over here. Yeah, so we studied together, and it's with Phil, whom a decade now later, that I founded our safari company, Jeffrey and Mickey Safaris with. And of course, more recently, our non-profit conservation organization, Musekesi Conservation. Interestingly, we hadn't formulated any of these plans that we have worked on the last few years at university, but it was obviously our friendship here that that helped to found that. So yeah, and this is us now, taken actually just last week. But yeah, in late 2012, so a little way, yeah, almost not quite a decade ago now, over a few beers and around a campfire, Phil and I had the sort of founding ideas for Jeffrey and Mickey Safaris. And by 2013, we had our first season of operation. We didn't really plan to reinvent the wheel. We just wanted to replicate the very classic Zambian safari camp of old, you know, with a walking safari emphasis, and importantly, being owner-run and owner-guided by passionate people. And it's something I think you'll all agree, it's tough to find an owner-run experience nowadays. And so, yeah, we were very aware of that, and we're very happy that we're, you know, sort of, we're still championing that today. But why specifically did we bother doing it? The major draw card to us was, you know, the thing that pushed us to put all the effort, time and money into this venture was the ability to have a lasting positive impact in a specific area. We didn't have any interest in building a camp next door to someone else where maybe the game was well known already or the roads already existed, although I can assure you that would have been a lot cheaper and a lot easier and probably would result in a few less grey hairs. But the Kafue is vast, and since we'd both been in the park since we were kids, we knew that there were many, many secret corners that were as yet unutilized. As such, in those early years, we spent time camping with anti-poaching officers, and that allowed us to get into some of the more remote sectors. And from a conservation perspective, we knew there were areas which might still have wildlife, but that if we went into those areas, we'd be able to have a positive impact by definition of being in those areas. And so ultimately the Musikesi area was one such area that we basically fell for. There were evident signs of neglect in the area, but there was still this outstanding natural beauty, as you saw from that video. It was stunning. And it still had good remnant populations of wildlife despite the evident stresses that it had been under. As I was showing on the map earlier, I think before I cut out, Musikesi is on the eastern bank of the Kafue River in the northern part of the park. And there were no roads in that area, no roads to get there. There has never been, since the park's ever been here, any infrastructure on the eastern bank of the river in the northern part of the park. So we liked the area, but we had to get in there. So our first job was to build a road, which we did by hand, but we had to do that from the nearest road, which was 50 kilometers away. That was no mean feat, but we were helped by a team of lads who were fantastic and actually who formed the core of our team today. Some of the staff at both Jeffrey and McKee Safaris and also some of the camp staff now at Musikesi Conservation are some of the same folk that built that road in. So yeah, it's a nice little story, but it wasn't easy to get into the area, but hopefully worthwhile. So what else can I add on? So the Kafue as a park is many different things. And one of those standout things is diverse. It's many different things. It has a phenomenal diversity of habitats. And of course, this leads to a fantastic diversity of flora and fauna. Often for me, this has been a little bit of a frustration in selling the Kafue because there isn't one image that can define the park. You know, for example, for folk that have never been to the Kafue, for folk that have never been, say, to the Masai Mara, if you were to show them a photo of one part of the Mara, it would be pretty reflective of the greater area. The same maybe for the Congo. You know, you could tell this is a rainforest in the Congo Basin, even if it's miles away from the area you're in. Even the Luangwa, to be honest, a photo of the Luangwa is pretty depictive of the Luangwa. But the Kafue, what is the Kafue National Park? And these images here, the idea of this is to give you a little bit of an idea of the diversity. The image on the lower right corner, this is a vast, inaccessible salt pan, a massive open plain with natural upwellings. And then here on the bottom left, we have rapids in a meandering part of the river, white water rapids. Top left, granite. This is sort of an ancient granite outcrops, which are plentiful in the Miombo woodlands. And then the top right, this is also the Kafue. This is the plains of Pasanga in winter. And that's not a Photoshop photo. That's what the place looks like in the early mornings in wintertime. So it's so many different things, which is part of its charm. Some other interesting points on the park. The Kafue also had a significant historical black rhino population. Unfortunately, the last one was probably lost by the early 1990s. And the sad story of the loss of the rhino, it's a whole other talk in its own right. But it wasn't just a Kafue loss. Black rhino were extirpated from all of Zambia. And these maps here from an article in the 70s, I always find very poignant. They talk of populations of rhino. Let me get my marker again. Populations of rhino outside of the reserves. All these dots here are not national parks. And this wasn't all that. This is, I think this, early 70s. And as you can see though, this dark black patch here, this is a breeding, all the black patches are breeding populations of rhino. And this is the Kafue National Park. And as you can see, it was a very significant population of them for Zambia. But very sadly, there were none left in the whole of the country. Interestingly, there's no evidence of white rhino having been present in Zambia, at least not in sort of human knowledge, maybe fossil records, but black rhino was the rhino for Zambia. Aside from the loss of rhino, however, luckily, we believe that all other species are in the park, that are still in the park that always were there, other than the rhino, if that makes sense. So some other species, notable ones being wild dog, for example. The Kafue's got the second largest population of wild dog in Zambia. Coming on to cheetah next. Cheetah, it's the largest population of cheetah in Zambia as well, in the Kafue National Park. And so it has some very important populations of wildlife too. This image is an interesting map from our colleagues at the Zambian Carnivore Program. And these guys have got collared research animals throughout the park. Whilst you can see on this map, there's a bias to wildlife on the western bank of the river. As you can see, if I follow the river coming in here and bending round in the north of the park going south, remember that's because, as I said, there's never been any infrastructure on the eastern bank. Our Musakesi area is this area here on the eastern bank. And so I wanted to include this because there is one collared lioness on the eastern bank of the river. And she's part of our resident pride of lions. And interestingly, her pride has got the smallest home range size of any of the other prides of lions that are studied in the park. You see, a lot of these some of these dots are lions, some are cheetah, some are wild dog. But the other thing this map shows us is how much wildlife there is in the park. And so, if one was to come to the Kafue and not see the predators, it's not because they're not there. They are very well represented. There's a very healthy population of the large carnivores in the Kafue National Park. But there's still a lot to learn. As I said, this map only shows majority of wildlife on the western bank. So this brings me on to our elephants. And elephants are present very well in the Kafue National Park. Having said that, around the 50s, it was believed we had about 60,000 elephants in the park. At the moment, we reckon we're probably at about 4,000 to 6,000 elephants, although for the past about 5 or 10 years, it's believed that the populations of elephant in the Kafue are at least stable and very likely increasing. So that's a nice positive sign. And certainly from what we see on the ground here, it is an increase in sightings. And not just an increase in sightings of elephant, but also an increase in how relaxed the elephants in the Kafue National Park are. And so, I remember as a kid, in the Kafue, just to see an elephant was quite a treat. And this time in the history of the park, we have a very good population of elephant, and they're very easy to see, which is fantastic. One sort of large potential positive outcome for elephant in the Kafue, and of course other species, is with the continued investment in the Kaza Transfrontier Conservation Area. Some of you may be familiar with this sort of larger landscape conservation project. And this vast area of proposed linkages between existing wildlife centres would certainly make it easier for a recurrence of what was a once annual movement of elephants throughout a greater region. And I'll show you what I mean on the next slide by that. So it was always understood that not too long ago, the elephants of the Kafue were contiguous with those of the Zambezi and the Chobe system further south. The large-scale movement, may well still exist in higher numbers than we know at the moment, maybe still, and we hope so. But amazingly, this map shows us there was a collared bull elephant that made its way all the way down through Angola, Namibia, and all the way up through the southern part of the park to the Kafue National Park. Sorry, through the southern part of Zambia to the Kafue National Park. This was last year. And this movement is absolutely fantastic. Made its way all the way up here, and then all the way back down to Angola and the Caprivi Strip down here, and then even to the outskirts of Chobe. I found this absolutely fascinating. And again, it just highlights the importance of the Kafue system to the Kaza TFCA, and it mustn't be underestimated. As an aside to this, I also have an old university friend who was studying using camera traps and spore transects in this region here, south of Mulabezi, so nowhere near the park and outside of the buffer zones. And he found evidence of all major carnivores, including wild dog and cheetah, in this same track too. So these linkages just about hang on. And this is what the Kaza TFCA is all about, trying to keep these lines open. What else can I tell you about the Kafue? Let me turn the laser off here and go to the next slide. So the Kafue also has more antelope species naturally occurring than anywhere else by definition in the world. 21 recorded species of antelope. So I'll leave you to try and think about, try and even remember or think of 21 species of antelope. But notable specials that we find in good number include the roan antelopes, as you can see from this image, as well as sable, which I'll show you in the next image. This image has specifically interested me, showing the roan eating the rib cage of a hippo carcass. Now, I've seen for 3 years running now, the roan feeding on the very same carcass. I think this is known as osteophagia. And so, yeah, I hadn't read of it before in roan. I think I understand that oryx do this in more arid areas, but the Kafue is a very wet area. We understand, we think, with pretty good mineral contents, but maybe there's something we don't know, and the roan are telling us that. But some interesting behavior to be seen of what in many parts of Africa, including the other KNP, I know are very rare and very special to see. But in the Kafue, we see roan very well. And this next slide here, if you can see this along the bottom, is a fantastically large herd of sable antelope. And while sable can be seen very well throughout the entirety of the Kafue, from north to south, the Pasanga Plains area in the north of the park, we can see aggregations of up to 100 sable in the end of the dry season. And seeing them on an open plain like this is really quite unique. And these aren't one-off occurrences. These are sightings which, as the years go by, we have more and more of. So very encouraging signs for our antelope populations in the Kafue. And lastly, on the Kafue itself, it has a fantastic bird count, and with over 500 recorded species. Of course, lots of migrants like this dwarf bittern, which arrived with the onset of the rains. I wanted to put this photo in as well because this was taken just in November after a few rains, and the vibrancy of the green is very stark to the dry dust of a few months earlier. And yes, so whilst the size and the diversity of the Kafue is its largest asset, it has meant that effective management and law enforcement has always been a challenge. And this brings us now onto sort of the second half here, which is the conservation scene here in the Kafue. So yeah, these are some stark images for you, but it's the reality. Whilst like any national park, the responsibility for its protection ultimately lays with the government, and in Zambia's case, the Department of National Parks and Wildlife, or what we shorten to the DNPW. It's no secret that the sector and the department at large are severely underfunded and undersupported across all the national parks, not just the Kafue, but the whole country. As a consequence, you know, the majority of the other major parks in the country, let's say the Luangwa, South, North, Lower Zambezi, those parks have generally a single NGO working alongside the DNPW to support the efforts in those regions. Luckily, whilst the other parks are still very large, they're not on the same scale as the Kafue. And as such, the Kafue, in the Kafue landscape, there isn't one NGO that has the ability, the funds or the size to deal and support the park in its 22,500 square kilometer entirety. And so this has meant that several smaller organizations exist in the Kafue landscape. And there's a natural division of the park whereby we call them intensive protection zones, or IPZs. And these are basically areas of highest conservation concern and value have been earmarked throughout the park. And each NGO works towards the protection of one or more of those zones alongside the Department of National Parks. Luckily on the ground, the collaboration between our different organizations is actually very good, and it continues to improve and allow for more efficient sort of data outcomes and sharing of knowledge and even resources. I think it's fair also to say that, you know, that this rather piecemeal sort of conservation landscape of the Kafue would definitely vastly improve if either the Department of National Parks and Wildlife were afforded more budgetary support to sort of effectively manage a park this size, or more realistically, a larger NGO took over the management of the park alongside the department. This is something that the African Parks Foundation have been for several years exploring in the Kafue National Park. And it's no secret and no doubt that having the likes of African Parks on board would benefit the Kafue hugely. And I think in turn, the Kafue has the potential to be a flagship park for African parks. And it's certainly, if anything were to happen in the future there, it would certainly be a win-win, and something that we certainly keep our fingers crossed for. Yeah, these images are tough, aren't they? This dog on the lower left, it's got 2 legs. I knew this dog for 2 years with 3 legs, and a few years ago now, yeah, I found him again, and I could not believe it. And he stayed, he wasn't an alpha male, but he was looked after by the younger members of the pack. But absolutely remarkable animals. But the poor thing, yeah. So brings me on to the next slide, and where does Musikesi conservation fit within the landscape? And as I said, there's various smaller organizations within the park working together, and we're very proudly part of that landscape. So Musikesi Conservation is the non-profit organization that myself and Phil set up a couple of years ago. It was set up to tackle what was at the time an alarmingly sharp increase in illegal snaring in the Musikesi Lumbea area, that whole area on the eastern side of the Kafue River. Again, a whole talk could be had on the rigmaroles, the trials and tribulations of you have to go through to set up a conservation project in Zambia, but I won't do that. But we're very proud of what we've achieved to date, and we've got lots more to work on. This photo is of our teams of scouts, or our 2 teams of 6 scouts. We've got 12 chaps, and on the left there is Mike, our project manager, in front of our, what was at the time, newly built anti-poaching base camp. Yeah, so Mike unfortunately just come down with malaria today. So we wish him a recovery if he's listening in. So that brings us on to the next slide. And yes, as I said, we've got 2 teams of 6 rangers based out of our anti-poaching base camp. We call it the APU. It was funded and built for the teams to operate out of in an area that otherwise they wouldn't be able to operate effectively out of, quite a remote sector. And initially we managed to secure funding for the training of these additional 12 wildlife police officers or scouts. And I say additional because when we got the go-ahead from the Department of National Parks to support them, we were offered to take 12 scouts from other units in the park and choose the best team that we could put together. And it seemed a little bit odd for us. We didn't want to dilute the efforts of the rest of the park, so we said no. We'd rather pay and top up for the additional 12 scouts to add to the park-wide effort. And so yeah, we're very happy and lucky that we did. But our base camp was built, although we only have the 2 teams in at the moment, it's built with the capacity for to carry 5 teams that can operate out of it. And let's face it, that area, the Musikesi-Lumbea area that the Musikesi teams anti-poach is 2,400 square kilometers itself. And that's now under our remit to protect. And 2 teams of 6 chaps, as fantastic and wonderful as they are, it is still a drop in the ocean. So as an organization, we are looking to the future, and the next sort of step is to increase the amount of teams in and around the area to 5. And yeah, so with increased funding, more teams. Another sort of factor, a point of reference interest is that the Department of National Parks and Wildlife, the government, they cover this wages for the scouts because they are civil servants. But ourselves at Musikesi Conservation, we cover everything else. All their operational costs, bonuses, incentives, uniforms, rations, everything in between. So that's how that works, because we operate within the national park. So just back as an example to highlight just how bad the snaring had become. In 2017, we discovered very, very sadly that 7 of our resident lions, 7 had succumbed to snare-related deaths. And that was in about just under a 12-month period. It was pretty horrific to be, to see that. Myself and Phil, after all the effort and all the positivity we had seen, to see what we'd felt our hard work come undone. Our populations of lion in the Musikesi area had risen from what was just a handful of individuals up to 21 lions in 2012 across 2 different prides. That increase was just due to our mere presence in the area, discouraging the illegal activity. But the spike after that we saw taught us a very harsh lesson, that whilst presence can be a deterrent in very wild areas, initially, it can also be short-lived, and one mustn't rest on their laurels. So today, luckily, things are recovering phenomenally well, once again. And this is in large part thanks to the initial successes of Musikesi Conservation and our teams there, and our scouts. And this slide here is an amazing one. I wanted to highlight this chap on the top left here. So these are the resident male lions of the Musikesi pride. They were brothers, same age as they came in, same size manes. But on the left here is who we call Tripod, affectionately now, bless him. And this was the fresh snaring injury. You can see it just took off basically his toes and his pad. But the main condition and how that deteriorated almost straight away. You'd think he was a younger lion, but no, he's the same age as his more beautiful brother on the right-hand side. Yeah, so it's just interesting to see that. And I think the next slide shows you a little bit, again, quite sad, but it's interesting to see here how Tripod moves. And this is normal for him. It's absolutely amazing to see how in such good condition he is. It's very sad to see, but he's an absolute legend. And you wouldn't believe, with that gait that he has, last year, I saw him climb a tree and steal a leopard's kill out of a tree with his 3 legs. It was pretty graceful going up, not so much coming down. Yeah, we're very fond of the man. And this photo I took just a couple of days ago. And here he is looking particularly handsome. His mane seems to be coming back again, getting nice and dark. And this is him actually staring into a bush next to us, in which 7 new lion cubs, to him and his brother, were introduced to us for the first time. So it was a fantastic and very rewarding part of the roller coaster with our lions that we've had for the last few years. And here's a photo of those cubs that were in that bush. And I suppose the point of this is, whilst Tripod has lost his foot, and he's a bit of a burden on his fellow Pride members, being less able to partake in hunts and things like that, and still taking the lion's share, he's still very important to the survival of the cubs and this pride. Even vocally, himself and his brother, calling the 2 of them together is a big deterrent just by his mere presence.
So the Musakesi Lumbea area itself is 2,500 square kilometers, which in its own right is the size of many national parks and reserves in their entirety. And this is just a small fraction of this park. But it's now the remit of Musakesi Conservation to support the Department of National Parks in the protection of this zone, of this IPZ. This slide here gives a few pointers as to what the teams have achieved to date in what is a relatively short amount of time. As you can see, they're working very hard, and we're very proud of the results which have come in. But what makes Musakesi Conservation and the activities here a little bit unique? Well, in the Zambian landscape, tourism aids conservation a lot, and conservation projects and non-profits, often through guest-based donations, and these come in the form of conservation contributions, which are basically nightly additional fees that safari camps add on to their nightly rates, and then they collect these and send these on to the non-profits as a donation. Generally, those donations to non-profits equate to approximately 15% of the operational costs for those non-profits, and that's obviously a significant amount. It's slightly different in our case as Musakesi Conservation. However, we only have one other safari operator operating in the greater Musakesi Lumbea area. I'm going back a little bit, and as I said, the different camps, if you take, for example, a park like the Lower Zambezi, there are many different operators collecting lots of these small fees, but collectively they add up to that 15% of the operating costs. For example, the Lower Zambezi would be the Conservation Lower Zambezi, the NGO down there working. As I say, in our context, things are slightly different. There are no other tour operators in the region. And so we hope that if there is development in the region in the future, which is the ultimate aim, then we should hopefully get more support and more buy-in through the tourism operators. Having said that, the one major operator in the area is, of course, our own Jeffrey and McKeith Safaris. And as such, for the last 12 months, 70% of Musakesi Conservation's operating revenues to sustain the operations of Musakesi Conservation, 70% have come directly from our private enterprise, the Jeffrey McKeith Safaris. So that's a lot more than the 15%. And so whilst we're more than happy, of course, to keep doing that, in light of the current situation we find ourselves in today with coronavirus and the implication that's having on international travel, it therefore means that we're having to look more at grant-based funding to help sustain our efforts. and that's absolutely fine, of course. But what we aim for in the future is that we are, as an organization, as Musikesi Conservation, we are not overly reliant on either the being fed and funded by the profits of Geoffrey McKee Safaris, nor also on grant-based funding. But hopefully we can find a happy medium somewhere there. And so, yeah, and that's the situation that we're in at the moment. So in light of COVID-19 and the lack of revenue coming into Geoffrey McKee Safaris, the year ahead, will be a tough one. But luckily we've got a project manager who's just joined us. I'm sorry, a project coordinator is the official term. And her job is to help us look more at the grant-based funding to keep the results, as you see on this slide, coming in. So, yeah, I think that's it for the slideshow and for the talk. And thanks for listening in. It's a little bit about the Kafue National Park in general, and a little bit about the conservation scenario here in the Kafue National Park, and of course ourselves as Musikesi Conservation within that. So one last image here, lovely image of one of the leopards on the banks of the Kafue River, which we see quite a lot in the dry season. This could be it's almost like seeing jaguar in the Pantanal or something, but we're very blessed here, and thanks for listening once again. And if you have any further questions or would like a bit more information on the park or the conservation or ourselves with our tourism enterprise, then feel free to drop me an email or check out the websites. So thanks again for listening.